Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about fermentation and flavors. What is fermentation in alcohol terms? Fermentation is when sugar is broken down by the yeast and alcohol is created. Or in other words, it's when sugar is broken down to a new product through chemical reactions. And fermentation can give you up to 20% ABV, which is alcohol by volume. So it cannot produce gin, tequila, rum, anything above 20% alcohol. That would need a still and the distillation process. So that's a second addition after fermentation is done to make stronger drinks. Now, when we're talking about primary versus secondary fermentation, primary is the process that starts as soon as you insert the yeast into your wash. At first, the wash or the wort or the juice is the initial liquid that will be produced before creating the alcohol. And as soon as you sprinkle in the yeast, then the yeast is the magic factor to create alcohol. And during this stage of primary fermentation, the yeast multiplies quickly and there's a lot of visible activity. How do you know what this visible activity is? It's in the airlock and it starts bubbling and bubbling, and this means that the fermentation is working and that the yeast is eating the sugar. A little fact is that 70% of your alcohol is created during the primary fermentation, and this typically takes 3 to 5 days. Once this 3 to 5 days is over, the primary fermentation can move to the secondary fermentation, which is when you transfer your current alcohol to a secondary fermentation jar to age the product. So you can age your beer, you can age your wine in this secondary fermentation. And the secondary fermentation starts roughly 3 to 5 days after you've added the yeast and can last several months. And this typically is used to add flavoring to your alcohol. During this secondary fermentation, alcohol is already present inside your batch, and alcohol can slow down the process of yeast multiplying. Therefore, when the yeast have a hard time multiplying and a hard time eating the sugar, yeast can also eat their own dead cells. Quick question, do you use secondary fermentation? If so, how long do you leave it in secondary? Personally, I do not use secondary fermentation. I just leave it in the primary fermentation jar, but I will talk to you shortly about the pros and the cons of doing so. The main reason why brewers opt for secondary fermentation is to add a little flavor to your homebrew or to your wine. So what are the cons of secondary fermentation? First of all, when you're transferring it from your primary fermentation jar to your secondary fermentation jar, oxygen can slip in, and oxygen is never good when making alcohol. And you can also slip in contaminants when you open the lid, and this is not good. You have to keep the contaminants away. That's why we clean and disinfect all our equipment either with Star San or with other disinfecting products. Another con of using a secondary fermentation is that you shouldn't only buy one but two carboys, and this is more expensive. Therefore, you'll have to buy double the amount of containers and it takes twice as much space. And the third con of secondary fermentation is that it's just going to take you that much longer to drink your finished product, because you'll have to wait not only for the primary fermentation to be over, which is necessary to produce alcohol, but you'll have to wait for the secondary fermentation to finish. And depending on what flavors you like, you might have to age it for months or even years for some homebrewers. With these cons, there are also pros for having secondary fermentation. The first one is that you can clear your alcohol with less sediment at the bottom. So once your yeast stops eating all the sugar, it goes down to the bottom of the jar and the top part will be cleared off. This makes it less blurry to the drinker, which is a better experience overall when you drink clear drinks. However, in my opinion, I choose to cold crash it, put it in the fridge, accelerate this process, and make sure the yeast is cold. And once the yeast is cold, it goes dormant quicker and it clears up faster. Another method to clear up your alcohol is to use turbo clear or even clay. Let me know in the comments below if you use any of these methods to clear your alcohol. Some of you might be asking, why can't I just clear my batch in my primary fermentation jar? Why can't I cold crash it in the primary fermentation jar? And why can't I add flavor as well in the primary fermentation jar? The answer is that once your fermentation is done in the primary, your yeast will go to the bottom, and since alcohol is present inside your batch, it makes it hard for the yeast, and a lot of yeast will end up dying and staying at the bottom of the jar. And yeast actually is cannibalistic, so they eat their dead cells. And yeast eating dead yeast cells, all in the presence of the alcohol, tend to give it off flavors because it's in contact with the yeast eating dead yeast cells. Some might compare this to burning tire taste. Others might be asking, why is secondary fermentation so long? And this is typically to smooth out the taste, to make sure that the flavors blend with each other, and that the drinking experience is smooth. And you have to make sure that the yeast has eaten all the sugar present inside your batch for the alcohol to be at its full potential. And depending on how much sugar you put, the more sugar you put initially, the longer it's going to take for your yeast to finish eating this sugar. So if you want to make alcohol quicker, a little tip is to use less sugar and your fermentation will be done quicker. Therefore, if you're making 5% beer versus 12% wine, beer is typically going to ferment quicker because we're adding less sugar. And how do you know the percentage that you're going to receive at the end? It's based on the hydrometer. The hydrometer is going to let you know how much sugar is present inside your batch. And the percentage of alcohol is calculated based on the amount of sugar present at the beginning of fermentation and how much sugar is present at the end of the fermentation. Therefore, the difference in amount of sugar is going to determine the percentage of alcohol that has been produced. So as some are convinced that they want to transfer from primary to secondary fermentation, when do you know that primary fermentation is over? You'll know this in the bubbling airlock or lack of bubbling airlock. So as the airlock bubbles, this means that the yeast has more sugar to eat. However, as it bubbles slower and slower, this means that there's less CO2 produced. And there's less CO2 produced because there's no more sugar to be eaten by the yeast. When the sugar is eaten by the yeast, it produces alcohol, but there is a byproduct created, and this is CO2, and this shows in the airlock. However, if there is no more sugar eaten by the yeast, there will be no more airlock activity. Once you're in your secondary fermentation, you'll notice that the bubbling is slower. So it might be bubbling every 30 seconds now instead of every second. Compared to the primary fermentation, the bubbling in the secondary fermentation will be slower since there are less CO2 or carbon dioxide being produced. And one distinction is that the secondary fermentation is not a second fermentation. There's just one fermentation and it's the continuation of the first fermentation. It's simply to add flavor. And there's another option that you can have when you're done your primary fermentation. If, let's say, your primary fermentation is done and you do not like the taste of your alcohol, you'd like to make it sweeter, you can add some sugar. So you can add more sugar into your batch, and this is called back sweetening, and this is to adjust the flavor of your alcohol because you do not find it sweet enough. And for tips and tricks on how to make alcohol, you can book a class. The link is in the description below, and follow us on Instagram. We post more regularly on that platform, and if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.